For decades, Bigfoot has been portrayed in popular culture as a mysterious but essentially harmless creature, a shy forest giant that avoids human contact and disappears into the wilderness when spotted. The typical Bigfoot narrative involves brief sightings, blurry photographs, and massive footprints left behind as the creature flees from surprised hikers or hunters. But there is another category of Bigfoot evidence that does not fit this gentle giant narrative. Evidence that suggests something far more unsettling about these creatures' behavior, intelligence, and interactions with humans. Evidence that experienced outdoorsmen find deeply disturbing and that scientists examining it struggle to explain through conventional wildlife behavior or misidentification. This evidence does not come from hoaxers or attention seekers. It comes from law enforcement officers, forestry workers, wildlife biologists, and experienced hunters, people whose credibility and outdoor expertise make their accounts particularly difficult to dismiss. And it is not evidence of creatures accidentally leaving traces as they flee from humans. It is evidence suggesting deliberate behavior, coordinated activity, territorial marking, and in some cases, what appears to be stalking or predatory interest in human targets. This is the story of the most disturbing Bigfoot evidence ever documented. Why it challenges the harmless cryptid narrative, and why even skeptical scientists, after examining the physical traces, behavior patterns, and witness accounts, admit there is something occurring in the North American wilderness that does not fit any known animal's behavior profile. In September 2000, an experienced hunting guide named Todd Standing was leading an expedition in the remote Alberta wilderness when his group began noticing signs that something was watching their camp. It started subtly, the feeling of being observed, the unusual silence in the forest, and the absence of normal wildlife activity that experienced outdoorsmen recognize as warning signs that a large predator is near. But the signs escalated. On the second night, the group heard vocalizations unlike anything they had encountered before. The sounds were not animal howls or known wildlife calls. They were complex, variable vocalizations that seemed to come from multiple sources surrounding the camp in different directions. Some witnesses described them as almost language-like, structured sounds with patterns suggesting communication rather than simple territorial calls. The most disturbing aspect was the coordination. The vocalizations would start in one direction, then be answered from another location hundreds of yards away, then from a third position, as if multiple creatures were communicating about the camp's position and coordinating their movements. The pattern suggested intelligence and deliberate action rather than random animal activity. On the third night, the group found evidence that something had approached within meters of their tents while they slept. Large barefoot tracks measuring over 16 inches long and showing clear toe impressions circled the camp perimeter. The tracks did not show the pattern of an animal passing through the area. They showed deliberate circling, stopping at points where the creature would have clear views of the tents, and what appeared to be intentional placement near where the humans were sleeping. One set of tracks approached to within 6 feet of a tent, stopped, and then retreated following a different path, as if the creature had specifically come to that tent, observed whoever was inside, and then deliberately left without disturbing anything. The behavior was not consistent with an animal randomly foraging or passing through. It suggested intentional surveillance. Standing, who had guided in the backcountry for over 15 years and encountered bears, cougars, and wolves without incident, described the experience as unlike any wildlife interaction he had ever had. The intelligence implied by the coordinated vocalizations and deliberate approach patterns was deeply unsettling because it suggested the creatures were not simply avoiding humans, but actively studying them. The group abandoned the expedition the following day, not because they had seen a creature directly, but because the evidence of being systematically observed by something intelligent that operated at night was too disturbing to ignore. Standing reported the incident to wildlife authorities who found the account credible but had no explanation for what the group had experienced. This case represents a pattern that appears repeatedly in the most disturbing Bigfoot evidence. Behavior suggesting not just intelligence, but deliberate interest in humans, often manifesting as what witnesses describe as stalking or surveillance rather than accidental encounters. In 2012, a team of wildlife biologists conducting a forest survey in the Olympic National Forest in Washington state discovered a series of structures that defied explanation as natural formations or known animal behavior. The structures consisted of large trees, some with trunk diameters exceeding 12 inches, that had been broken at heights of 8 to 12 feet above the ground, and woven or stacked into elaborate formations. The trees were not cut or sawed, they were broken, with the breakpoints showing massive force applied in ways that bent and snapped trunks that would require thousands of pounds of force to break. Some trees were twisted as they were broken, showing spiral fracture patterns that structural engineers examining the evidence said would require force beyond what any single human could apply, even with tools. But the most disturbing aspect was not the force required to create the structures. It was their placement and apparent purpose. The structures were positioned along game trails and near water sources where humans would be likely to travel. They were arranged in ways that created visual markers visible from specific angles and directions, as if deliberately placed to be noticed by anyone traveling along certain routes. Some structures incorporated bones, deer skulls, rib cages, and skeletal remains positioned within the stick formations in ways that appeared intentional rather than coincidental. The placement of remains within structures is behavior associated with human ritual or territorial marking, not with any known North American wildlife species. Wildlife biologists, examining the structures, ruled out known animal explanations. Bears occasionally break saplings and small trees, but do not create elaborate stacked or woven formations. No North American animal has been documented creating territorial markers using bones arranged in specific patterns within constructed stick formations. Storm damage creates broken trees, but does not arrange them into structured patterns or incorporate skeletal remains into formations. The structures bore similarities to great ape behavior, particularly gorillas and chimpanzees, which create display structures by breaking vegetation and arranging it in ways that communicate presence and dominance to other members of their species. But North America does not have great apes, according to conventional zoology, and the force required to break the trees exceeded what known apes could generate. The biologists documented the structures extensively with photographs, measurements, and structural analysis, but their report was never officially published. Colleagues who saw the documentation described it as the most compelling evidence of unknown primate activity in North America they had encountered, because the structure's placement and apparent purpose suggested intelligence and possibly territorial behavior directed toward humans traveling through the area. One biologist examining the evidence noted that if the structures were created by an unknown primate species, their placement along human travel routes suggested the creatures were either monitoring human movement through the territory or deliberately marking boundaries they wanted humans to recognize. Either interpretation implied unsettling levels of awareness about human activity and possibly intentional communication directed at humans. In October 2015, a forestry worker in Northern California was conducting timber surveys in remote national forest when he encountered what he described as the most terrifying experience of his life. Not because he saw a creature, but because of what he heard and how it responded to his presence. Working alone, approximately 5 miles from the nearest road, the worker began hearing vocalizations in mid-afternoon. The sound started as distant howls, but escalated over the course of 20 minutes into what he described as screams. High-pitched, prolonged vocalizations that carried for what he estimated was over a mile, based on how the sounds echoed through the valleys. The vocalizations were disturbing enough that the worker began retreating toward his vehicle. As he moved, the sounds changed in ways that suggested whatever was making them was tracking his movement. When he stopped, the vocalizations would pause. When he moved, they would resume, consistently coming from positions that placed the source between him and his vehicle. The worker altered his route, attempting to circle around toward his truck from a different direction. The vocalizations shifted to match his new path, again positioning themselves between him and his escape route. The pattern repeated multiple times over the course of 90 minutes as he attempted different approaches, each time finding that the sounds relocated to block his most direct path out. The intelligence and tracking ability this implied was terrifying. Whatever was making the sounds was not randomly vocalizing. It was monitoring his position, predicting his movement, and deliberately positioning itself to control his access to his vehicle. The behavior matched predatory stalking patterns documented in large cats and other apex predators that herd prey or cut off escape routes before attacking. The worker eventually reached his truck by making a wide detour that added over 2 miles to his hike, constantly hearing the vocalizations tracking his movement until he was within sight of the road. Only when he reached his vehicle did the sounds stop. He reported the incident to Forest Service supervisors and refused to work alone in remote areas afterward. An investigation found no evidence of human involvement. The locations where the vocalizations occurred were miles from any road and inaccessible except by difficult hiking through dense forest. The Forest Service report noted that no known North American animal produces vocalizations matching the witness's description or demonstrates the tracking and herding behavior he experienced. The case represents a disturbing pattern in some Bigfoot encounters, behavior suggesting these creatures do not just avoid humans but sometimes actively track, follow, or even herd them in ways that indicate high intelligence and possibly predatory assessment. Witnesses in these cases describe feeling hunted rather than simply observed, and the creatures are capable of predicting human movement and strategically positioning themselves to control the human's options. Perhaps the most disturbing physical evidence involves what researchers call gifting behavior and arranged objects. In multiple locations where Bigfoot activity has been reported over extended periods, witnesses have found objects deliberately placed or arranged in ways that suggest intentional communication or possibly testing of human responses. In 2018, a property owner in rural Oklahoma, who had experienced years of unusual activity on his land, including vocalizations, large tracks, and objects being moved, began documenting a pattern of objects appearing in specific locations. The objects included stacked rocks arranged in cairn-like formations, deer bones arranged in geometric patterns, and objects from the property, tools, buckets, children's toys, relocated to prominent positions where they would be easily noticed. The arrangement showed characteristics suggesting intelligence and intention. Rocks were stacked in balanced formations that would be difficult to create accidentally. Bones were arranged in patterns, circles, lines, and crosses. Patterns that do not occur naturally. Objects from the property were placed in locations where the owner would encounter them during his daily routine, as if whatever was moving them knew his habits and was deliberately placing items where he would find them. Most disturbingly, the patterns escalated when the owner attempted to communicate back. When he left food offerings where objects had appeared, the offerings would be taken and replaced with arranged sticks or rocks. When he placed cameras to document the activity, the cameras would be moved or covered, not destroyed, but deliberately repositioned or obscured, suggesting awareness of what the cameras were and what they did. This behavior pattern, deliberate object arrangement, apparent awareness of human routines, responses to human attempts at communication, and recognition of surveillance technology suggests cognitive capabilities far beyond any known North American wildlife. Bears raid food and occasionally interact with human objects, but they do not arrange items in geometric patterns or demonstrate awareness of camera function. No known animal shows this combination of behaviors. Researchers studying the property documented the object placements and arrangements over 18 months. The patterns were consistent, repeatable, and showed apparent responses to the owner's actions. When he placed specific colored objects in certain locations, similar colored objects would appear in other locations within days. When he created rock cairns, additional cairns would appear nearby, but with different structural characteristics, as if something was mimicking the behavior while adding its own variations. The implication is deeply unsettling. Whatever was creating these arrangements was intelligent enough to recognize patterns, mimic human behavior, respond to communication attempts, and understand that cameras were recording devices that should be avoided or obscured. These are cognitive capabilities suggesting intelligence approaching or possibly matching human levels in some domains. Some of the most disturbing evidence comes from cases where multiple witnesses report coordinated activity that suggests pack or group behavior with sophisticated communication and tactical coordination. In 2016, a group of experienced hunters in the Pacific Northwest reported an encounter that forced them to abandon their camp and leave the area. Over 3 days, the group observed what they described as a family group of at least 4 large bipedal creatures moving through the area around their camp. The creatures were not simply passing through. They appeared to be systematically exploring the area around the camp, approaching from different directions at different times, vocalizing back and forth in what sounded like coordinated communication, and demonstrating what the hunters described as strategic movement, using terrain and vegetation for concealment and approaching in ways that suggested they understood fields of view and sight lines. The overall impression was coordinated action. On the second night, the group heard vocalizations at close range from at least 3 different positions surrounding the camp at the same time. The sounds were not random animal calls, but appeared coordinated. One would vocalize, then another would respond from a different location, then a third would call from another position, creating a pattern that suggested the sources were communicating about the camp and the humans inside. One hunter, a military veteran with combat experience, described the pattern as similar to tactical radio communication, with different units reporting positions and coordinating movement around a target. The comparison was disturbing because it suggested not just intelligence, but organizational structure and possibly tactical thinking. The group attempted to observe the creatures directly, but found that whenever they positioned themselves to watch one area where sounds had come from, activity would shift to a different location, as if the creatures were monitoring the humans' positions and deliberately staying out of direct view. The pattern suggested awareness of where the humans were looking and strategic avoidance of observation. When the group decided to leave on the 3rd day, they found that equipment they had stored outside their tents had been moved during the night. Nothing was damaged or taken, but items had been relocated. Tent stakes had been pulled up and placed in neat rows. Firewood had been restacked in different configurations. Backpacks had been moved from where they had been placed. The message was clear. Whatever had been around the camp could have accessed the humans while they slept, but chose instead to demonstrate its presence and capabilities by rearranging objects in ways that proved it had been there. The behavior suggested not random curiosity, but deliberate communication, showing the humans they were vulnerable and at the creature's mercy without actually harming them. The hunters, all experienced outdoorsmen who had encountered bears, cougars, and other wildlife without significant concern, described the experience as fundamentally different from any wildlife encounter. The intelligence, coordination, and apparently deliberate nature of the creature's behavior was deeply unsettling because it suggested they were being studied and tested by something with cognitive capabilities comparable to humans. Wildlife biologists and anthropologists who reviewed the hunter's account noted that the described behavior, coordinated group movement, tactical positioning, deliberate object manipulation to communicate with another species, and restraint in not harming vulnerable targets represents cognitive and social sophistication documented only in great apes and humans. No North American animal shows this behavioral profile. The accumulation of this type of evidence, coordinated vocalizations, territorial structures, tracking behavior, object arrangement, group tactical movement, and apparent communication directed at humans, creates a disturbing picture that challenges both skeptical dismissal and the benign forest giant narrative. If the evidence represents misidentification or hoaxing, it demands an explanation for how independent witnesses across vast geographic areas and time periods report consistent patterns of behavior that do not match any known animal. It also requires explaining physical evidence, like tree structures that require thousands of pounds of force to create, and arrangements and patterns not documented in any North American wildlife behavior. If the evidence represents real encounters with an unknown species, we must confront the implications. North America could host a large, intelligent primate, capable of sophisticated behavior, including apparent communication, tool use and object manipulation, group coordination, and possibly deliberate interaction with humans. The most disturbing aspect is what the behavioral evidence suggests about these creatures' capabilities and intentions. They are not simply avoiding humans. They are actively monitoring human activity, entering human camps when occupants are vulnerable, creating territorial markers along human travel routes, and in some cases appearing to stalk, track, or test human responses. The restraint shown in many encounters, approaching camps but not attacking sleeping humans, following individuals but not harming them, and demonstrating presence through object manipulation rather than aggression, suggests intelligence and possibly curiosity rather than predatory intent. Yet the capabilities demonstrated in these encounters show these creatures could harm humans if they chose to, which makes their restraint a choice rather than an inability. Scientists examining the evidence struggle with the implications. Accepting that the behavioral patterns are real requires accepting that an unknown large primate exists in North America, with intelligence and social sophistication approaching great apes or early hominins. This contradicts fundamental assumptions about North American fauna and what species could remain undiscovered in well-explored regions. But dismissing the evidence requires explaining away consistent patterns reported by credible witnesses, physical traces that do not match known animal behavior, and documented incidents that wildlife experts admit do not fit any conventional explanation. The most honest assessment from researchers who have examined the disturbing evidence is that something unusual is occurring in North American wilderness. Whether it is an unknown primate species, a behavioral phenomenon in known animals that has not been documented, or some combination of misidentification and genuine anomalies, the pattern of evidence is too consistent and too well documented to dismiss entirely. The disturbing evidence suggests that if Bigfoot exists, it is not the shy creature depicted in popular culture, but something far more intelligent, capable, and aware of humans than comfortable narratives acknowledge. The creatures appear to study humans, test their responses, communicate with each other about human presence, and make deliberate choices about how and when to interact with people. Witnesses who have experienced these more disturbing encounters often describe being fundamentally changed by the experience. They do not just believe in Bigfoot's existence, but recognize that something intelligent inhabits the wilderness alongside humans, something that chooses when to be seen and when to remain hidden, something that monitors human activity and makes calculated decisions about interaction. The evidence remains controversial and contested. Mainstream science largely refuses to investigate seriously, dismissing reports regardless of witness credibility or evidence quality. But the accumulation of disturbing behavioral evidence, physical traces, and consistent patterns across independent reports suggests the phenomenon deserves rigorous scientific investigation rather than reflexive dismissal. The most disturbing Bigfoot evidence ever found is not a clear photograph or a body. It is the behavioral patterns suggesting intelligence, coordination, and deliberate interaction with humans. It is the physical traces that cannot be explained through known animal behavior. It is the consistency of witness reports describing experiences that challenge our understanding of what inhabits North American wilderness. Scientists cannot explain it because the evidence does not fit comfortable categories. It is too consistent to dismiss entirely, but too anomalous to accept without challenging fundamental assumptions about wildlife, intelligence, and what species remain undiscovered. What is certain is that people with credibility and outdoor experience continue reporting encounters with something that behaves unlike any known animal. Physical evidence continues appearing that does not match conventional explanations. And the pattern suggests that if these creatures are real, they are far more aware of us than we are of them. The forest is watching. And sometimes what watches back is more intelligent, more capable, and more disturbing than we want to acknowledge.